title of this panel is Spiritual Reflection, Practices, and Resilience, Lessons from Contemplative and Nature-Based Wisdom. I'm so grateful to all the speakers on this panel who agreed to join, all of whom have been doing amazing environmental, dedicated climate work. And the moderator for this panel is Mary Evelyn Tucker. She is probably the premier scholar on religion and ecology globally. She, along with John Grimm, founded and directs the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. And with John Grimm, her husband, she organized 10 conferences on world religions and ecology at Harvard that became the definitive volumes on different religions and their perspectives and approaches towards ecological protection. And I just want you to understand that before they did this, there was very little out there. Her own research area is Asian religions. Her journey began in Japan with her teacher, Thomas Berry, whom some of you probably have heard of. She is a prolific author and scholar, and also created with John and with Brian Thomas Swim, she created this multimedia project, a film called Journey of the Universe, which is absolutely spectacular, and everyone should check it out. I hope there are links going in chat right now of all of these different things. She is my personal mentor and my dear friend. Emmy, I'm handing it over to you.
Thank you so much, Tequila, and what an amazing conference you've been organizing, strategizing, planning for so many months, and I congratulate you, your staff, the dedication, the spirit of this, the amazing presenters and participants. It's quite a moment, isn't it? It's like an explosion of energy, a waterfall for new thinking, refreshing the mind and spirit, as Bobby just did so beautifully. And especially a moment, I would just say very briefly, because I want the other participants to introduce themselves, and then we'll have a little bit of conversation among ourselves, but we are going to welcome questions from the audience. So this sensibility of an environmental movement that's been growing for decades, of course, a largely secular movement, is now beginning in a conference like this, and in many of you activists and religious leaders and spiritual teachers. This is a new moment, isn't it, for environmentalism, social justice, environmental justice, to incorporate something that has not been incorporated before, namely spiritual practices, meditation, contemplation, etc., in a sense of dealing with climate grief, eco-anxiety, trauma. And, you know, I'm at the Yale School of the Environment, and that is a very science-based place, a very policy-based place, where law and technology and economics matter. But our dean 17 years ago, Gus Speth, brought John and me there because he said we need values, ethics, and even a spiritual sensibility, along with all the arts, which many of you are involved with. But there's a joint program at Yale between the School of the Environment and the Divinity School. But still, we're dealing with these academic institutions that are so siloed, and certainly secular institutions like Yale, which can not really incorporate the kinds of things that have been so central to this conference. But with the push of so many of you in this direction, with student interest in this at the Divinity School, they're working on chaplaincy for eco-anxiety and climate despair and grief and so on. So the next generation, and again, many of you are going to push this forward and I think make these secular institutions open up. But it's going to take a long time. It's going to be something that a science-based reductionist mindset has got to enter into and be open to. So, and I just want to say that an encouraging sign, Tequila just mentioned, we started, as many of you know, these conferences at Harvard with hundreds of environmentalists and scholars and religious people. And it was 25 years ago, actually, that we began those conferences, 27 to be exact. But just today, I heard that there's a position in religion and ecology at Harvard Divinity School, which wasn't there. And there's also going to be a position at Yale Divinity School in religion and ecology. So maybe some of you can apply and be part of this. We like to say there's a field in academia, but there's a force in the larger society for this moral, spiritual transformation. And that's the huge contribution of this conference. Now, on that note of how we sort of balance a field and a force, an academic sensibility that's got to be part of the larger discussion, and solutions, I do want to just open up the floor for an introduction from Yuria, who's at Berkeley, both with the Department of Psychology and a program on, let me just get the title, she can tell us, but Other and Belonging Institute. So this is an example of new openings, isn't it, within academia? And she's been involved in the American Academy of Religion and the Indigenous Religions Tradition section, et cetera. But let me have Yuria, a very, very special woman from Chiapas, who's doing remarkable work. I urge you to look at her website for the classes she's offering, for the writing she's doing, and for the spirit she's bringing to these efforts. Yuria, over to you to share the kind of work that you're doing.
Maria Evelyn, lektaleshe bamayesh binti awilalik on Yuria Silidwin, Kon Hatumbalam now took my ethic that circular Chiapas. You just heard my indigenous Maya Celta language. Since we are speaking about resilience in the Anthropocene, I start by acknowledging my roots, starting with my lands from indigenous perspectives. That is the very core of our ancestry. Our lineage is go directly into the depths of Mother Earth. And so after that, it comes our human lineage of indigenous stewards. And then I use my language because it is also a way of stating indigenous presence and the work that the 5,000 indigenous groups in the world are doing precisely to bring awareness of the climate emergency and the different ways that we can regain and reclaim again our voices to belong into our ecosystem. And that's the kind of work that I've been doing for 2 decades already. And also what I brought to the contemplative studies field, the indigenous ways of contemplation. And that's also what I'm engaging at the UC Berkeley. I am in a multi-year project working with the indigenous communities of the Americas to see what practices of contemplation really regain our reverence for Mother Earth and how we can return our ways of belonging to a global community. As you well know, there is so much hype on the flourishing of humanity, but we must really understand that there is no human flourishing before Mother Earth flourishing first, right? So the indigenous perspective that is very diverse, that is really broad, really have also common ideas on how we regain these practices by returning our roots to Mother Earth, and how the very contextual aspects of culture, our own identities that are formed by, first and foremost, owing our responsibility to the lands and our very extensive circle of care that includes our other than human relatives. And within that, in the Othering and Belonging Institute, I'm working on reclaiming those indigenous perspectives as well, as being now really participants of the decision-making process that is affecting directly our lives and our peoples, and reclaiming the ownership to territories and governance of these lands that we are trying to take care of at the global level. So that is just a little piece of the different realms in which I'm working, and that I hope to also bring some practices and share some of this awareness with all of you. Thank you so much, dear Mary Evelyn.
Thank you, Yuridia. And we hope you'll speak about your wonderful sense of the ethics of belonging and the compassion and mindfulness work that you do and so on, which is invaluable. And with that spirit, let's turn to Lama Rod Owens, who also comes from within a contemplative tradition, Buddhism, and is doing quite remarkable work in a whole range of areas. Hello, Rod, so nice to see you. That include integrating the social and spiritual wisdom, which again, we have a long way to go, don't we? But I'm very intrigued by his new book, or the new saints, which I think is something we need to consider. Grief, from grief and loneliness to radical acceptance. What a beautiful phrasing there. Something we are all working on, and this conference again highlights that. And work on free radicals, the conversation, I believe, and something you're convening. And the Dharma of spiritual abolition. I love this. So you're giving people all kinds of techniques, I think, for developing resilience, which is the topic here, for the work that needs to be done. So without further ado, give us some further understanding of this quite broad, quite remarkable work, and the depths that it takes for you to do it as well. Thank you for being here, Rod.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Yuria. And thank you to Loka for initiating this program. Again, my name is Lama Rod. I use he, him pronouns, and I live and teach on the ancestral lands of the Creek, Cherokee, and Muskogee people, which we call Atlanta, Georgia now. I'm currently teaching for a bit on Abenaki ancestral lands up in New Hampshire. Doing this work, of helping folks to connect back to the consciousness of the land. I am a Tibetan Buddhist teacher. Lama is my title of authorization within the tradition. And for so long, as a person who descends from enslaved people, so much of my work and longing my whole life has been about freedom and liberation, continuing the work of my ancestors into the future for my descendants, so my descendants may have a more liberated future. And as Yuria pointed out in their beautiful introduction, to be a person, to be a human, to belong is really to be rooted in land, to be connected to land. And I identify as a displaced indigenous person, as my ancestors were forcibly taken from their land in Western Africa and brought here, first through Jamestown and then resettled in the South as enslaved people. So my longing is to connect to land as a vehicle for liberation. But I also understand that there are so many systems in play that keep us from really connecting to the consciousness of the land and to actually experiencing a type of freedom from the ways in which these systems have conditioned us to be in a really imbalanced and disruptive relationship to the land. And when we're not in right relationship to the land, we are not connected to our relations, to all beings connected to the land. We're not connected to the consciousness of plants, our plant siblings and relations. And so much of this also is about trauma too. This connection from the land is actually an expression of trauma that we all carry in our bodies. And that trauma makes it very difficult for us to connect to the consciousness of the land. And when we're disconnected from the land, we're not sensitive to the land, to the environment. And I think that is the heart of our climate change work, is to actually experience a re-embodiment in order to really reconnect to the land and to begin to live in right relationship to the land, and in right relationship with all of our relations connected to the land. My work comes through spiritual practice, through the work of contemplative practice, helping folks really reconnect to their bodies in order to reconnect to the land, learning to rely on the land. We're learning to rely on the earth in order to understand how to live in right relationship with the earth. And I rely on a variety of methods, from meditation to chanting to plant medicine and indigenous medicines as well. But just being on land, connecting to the land, connecting to plant consciousness is so incredibly important in my work, right? And one thing that I really focus on, as Mary pointed out, in terms of my next book, brokenheartedness is such an important part of my work, the deep hurt and the pain that we all carry, which makes it really hard for us to be in our bodies and thus to be connected to the land and the earth itself, right? I believe that in order to really sustain an effective climate change movement, we also have to be concerned with all these systems that actually have produced lots of disembodiment and trauma for us, including capitalism, racism, transphobia, and all of the ways in which we replicate imperialism and colonialism to dominate and suppress all people, right? And so I want to disrupt that, because I want to return back into an honest, direct relationship to the land. I want to live in right relationship and balanced relationship to the land. So that's what I'll offer. Thank you so much for this space.
Thank you, Lama Rod. It's very moving. And I just want to add that here we've got wonderful representation from indigenous traditions, which are hugely varied all over the world. And Uria's work of several decades is so rich and unfolding. And John Grimm, my husband, of course, is also a specialist in indigenous religions, which was one of the largest conferences at Harvard in 1997, indigenous peoples from all over the world. But I also just want to highlight that the Asian religions, Buddhism in particular, of course, has this amazing sense of interdependence, of relationality, of kinship, of sentient beings in the world, of ecosystems as alive and dynamic, and Zen practices, Tibetan practices, all bring this forward. So as do the traditions of Taoism and Confucianism that I study in East Asia. So I think it's part of recovering and reevaluating these traditions in our own time and filtering them through, as you've just said, through trauma and Uria's work as well, that these new filters are bringing forth spiritual wisdom from all over the planet. And that's, I think, it's a new moment. It's an exciting moment. It's a challenging moment. But that makes a transition to one of the great leaders in this movement of religion and ecology, and that is Reverend Fletcher Harper, who's an Episcopal minister. He's been at this just along the same lines as we have from 1995 and earlier. And he did his work at Princeton and then at Union Theological Seminary, which is one of the great places for activism and moral fervor and force that he's carried forward for many, many years. He founded Green Faith, which was a national organization here in the US, very, very effective, but he took it to another level, has made it international. There's groups all over the world now working on pipeline resistance and rebellion, forming some of the most important protests of religious leaders, religious communities, religious academics in the world, honestly. So I'd love for Fletcher to step into this space and give us a sense of your own journey and the importance that I hear often from you of activism and a sense maybe of outrage even as to where we are. But Fletcher, thank you for all your work, and over to you.
No, thank you for your really kind words, Mary Evelyn, and Yuria and Rod. Thank you very much also for your wisdom and good words. It's a pleasure to be here. And I said to Mary Evelyn and Tequila that I'm not sure that I would claim to fit within the title of this session. I am an Anglican priest, and that is a tradition of some of the most brutal colonization in the world, and was the spiritual lacquer that was sort of laid on top of that. So that's strike one. I'm a cis white straight man. Strike 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe. I don't know. But where I'm going to come at this from today is that at Green Faith, we're really privileged. We work with people in different parts of Africa, Asia, Latin America, North America, Europe. We oppose and try to stop new fossil fuel projects and related financing. We argue in support of a just transition for impacted workers and communities. We fight for universal access to clean energy and for funds for loss and damage. And I'm feeling particularly raw today because I have a number of close friends and colleagues who live in right near and in Lahaina, Maui, which has been burned to the ground over the past 40 to 48 hours. It's a beautiful city, very touristy, like much of Hawaii is, but that's not the Hawaiians' fault. Beautiful small city on the coast, has an enormous amount of remains of pre-contact architecture, and we don't know what kind of condition that is in at this point. But it's burned down for the same reason that is behind every single other sort of thing that we work on at Green Faith, which is that hyper-capitalist financial institutions and multinational corporations, the extractives, combined with governments that are either corrupt, intentionally destructive, or inept, are waging an outright battle to destroy the planet. And that is not an oversimplification. It's a simple presentation of something, but it's not simplistic. No sane person can look at the evidence and conclude otherwise. And so the question that I come to this conversation with, and I will say clearly that I'm hot today because of what is happening in Maui, but I don't know. I think that in terms of the title of this subject, what I'd like to wrestle with is we find excessive quiescence and dormancy in religious and spiritual communities around the world around these issues. We see too few religious leaders who really do have cultural and often political power. We see very few of them willing to speak out directly about these issues. We absolutely see brave and courageous indigenous leaders all over the world putting their lives on the line regularly. But when it comes time for higher level leaders in these sort of quote unquote global traditions, the vast majority of the time they're asleep at the switch. And this is an issue about the legitimacy of a lot of religions at this stage from our perspective. If religions want to lay claim to some kind of credibility in generations to come, they must chuck their passivity into the fire, and they must do what has always been necessary to be done to change cripplingly powerful systems, which is that they need to work with secular activists and get up out of the pews, off the prayer rugs, off the meditation cushions, and into the streets in a sustained and disciplined and peaceful manner to demand change. I think that as religious communities, as Mary Evelyn said, I've been doing this work for a long time. And I don't see enough movement from religious or spiritual communities, and want to ask us to wrestle with excessive comfort with dialogue and insufficient courage for confrontation. So I'll stop there.
I love that challenge, Fletcher, and I so agree with you. And would just add that this fossilization of religious worldviews, either for a transcendent otherworldly reward or salvation outside this world, whatever it might be, there's many reasons why religion has taken such a long time. And that's in divinity schools as well as in the religious communities at large. So I'm just going to ask a few questions that maybe we can have a little bit of dialogue here, and then open it up to discussion questions from the participants. In this particular panel is titled on spiritual reflection practices and resilience, lessons from contemplative and nature-based resilience. So having this challenge that Fletcher's just put forward of quiescence or quietude, which my professor at Columbia, who's a Confucian scholar because he was all about activism and change in the world, he actually felt that Buddhism was too quiescent in some of its forms. So Lama Rod, maybe you can pick that up at some point. But I guess the question would be, how do we balance this sense of contemplation and action? And how do we find these sources of resilience? And since I sort of threw it over to the Buddhist path for a moment, because socially engaged Buddhism is largely Western, although it's in Sri Lanka and Thailand with incredible leaders there. But I just would love you to bring forward a sense of Buddhism and its contemplative and active sides here as it forms its own Western sensibilities and communities. Lama Rod.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, as a convert Western Buddhist, I actually got involved in Buddhism because of the potential for action. I started as an activist and an organizer, and I've been engaged in social change since I was a teenager. I've moved through years of being a full-time activist. And it was during my years of being a full-time activist that I realized that I needed to do more than action. Like there was actually change that I had to undergo in order to see the change that I wanted to see in the world, right? And of course, that led me into contemplative practice, into Tibetan Buddhism in particular. But in the Western context, we owe so much to Thich Nhat Hanh, for instance, for being such an embodiment of justice. Organizations like the Buddhist Peace Fellowship, which has been around, I think, since the 70s in different capacities, have been really leading, right, this awakening movement of justice in this country. For me, I began my formal work as a teacher by writing and publishing Radical Dharma, which was a conversation with two other colleagues on race, and racial justice, from a contemplative Buddhist perspective. And I've continued that work by looking at the transformative power of anger in my last book, Love and Rage. So for me, this is what I do, right? And I see so much of my work as inspiring and motivating other contemplative practitioners, including mindfulness practitioners, as well as Buddhists, to engage in this really radical work of first actually engendering compassion, like real care, right, for the suffering of others, but also real care for our own suffering, right? And to link that care into thinking about skillful action, right, to disrupt systems of harm and violence that impact all of us, right? And again, I just want to reiterate that is an expression, that is compassion. Compassion is about action. It's not just feeling the care, but it's also figuring out how to intervene to disrupt suffering and injustice on the spot, right? And, you know, as Reverend Fletcher pointed out too, I think we get so comfortable with dialogue and conferences, you know, and media and podcasts, but we're not so great with being on the front lines, right? Being with people, being on the land, right? Actually beginning to experience the suffering and confusion and the anxiety of folks really trying to make sense of what it means to essentially face mortality and change and impermanence, right? So really caring, but I would just say this, just to finish up, I would say in American convert Buddhist communities is really dominated by white folks, you know, and I don't believe that white majority groups can lead justice movements, you know. And so my work is to help us to establish the voices of Black, Brown, Indigenous folks, including heritage practitioners as well, within these movements, particularly around climate instability.
Thank you so much. Of course, you're naming some of the great movements that are activists oriented, the Buddhist Peace Fellowship and so on, and we can go back to Asia, speak about the Sarvodaya movement, which of course is Gandhi inspired and help in all kinds of ways for poverty, for social justice and the environment. And one of the great leaders I just wanted to give a shout out for that is Ariadne in Sri Lanka, who founded the Sarvodaya movement there in 1958 and has been tireless in helping villages and communities and so on with survival, environmental, and social issues. And of course, in Thailand, there are many monks who are ordaining trees and trying to protect their forests for many, many years. So we could name activists from Asia and from the US. And I think in addition to Thich Nhat Hanh, who's so extraordinary, is of course the Dalai Lama. This is why Tibetan Buddhism has such an incredible lineage of environmental work and activism. So thank you so much for that response. And then as we go over to Uriya, this contemplation and action, I need not really say more because that's what you've been working on for a long, long time. But how would you respond to this discussion that we're having right now?
Yes, very engaging discussion and extremely important topics. From also responding what Fletcher brought in the beginning of the quiescence or the complacency that comes, and then of course following up with Lama Rod on the issue of the lack of representation, you know, the problematics of race and class that are very rarely put forward in the spiritual communities, you know, that, and then the even more problematic trap of spiritual bypassing, you know, like the complacency in which the spiritual communities fall because they're probably urban privileged landscapes are so far removed from what is affecting the world. You know, Reverend Fletcher spoke about what's happening in Maui. We know very well what's happening in the Pacific, the rest of the Pacific Islands that are also endangered, what's happening in the wildfires in Canada. And we know, of course, that most of the communities that are being most affected are indigenous communities, right? The ones that are rightly living in those areas and that are suffering the dramatic impacts of climate change. My own communities in the highlands of Chiapas is an endangered landscape that's about to be extinguished in 2030, and is the only remnants of the specific mesophilic forest in the whole of North America. So we feel it right away. And Ramarod spoke of, and I also brought it from the beginning, like how our identities are so connected to the land. So the compassion within indigenous perspectives is not only for our human relatives, but since we speak about what I call kin relationality, that we see all of existence as kin, including phenomena. So like the bodies of water, our winds, this is our sun, of course, our Mother Earth, all of them are our ancestor, are our relatives. So we guide our action because we own the responsibility for well-being to all these beings with whom we share this existence. So the process of understanding how to engage in right action comes from understanding the complexities of flourishing, right? It's not only the sitting in a cushion to create a sense of self-regulation or well-being for the self, but rather to engage in ethical behavior, understanding what are the deep roots of the narratives that we keep perpetuating onto ourselves, as peoples that have been oppressed or falling into systems of domination, into regaining this, seeing the shadow in the eye, in a way, like really understanding that the part of distress, anxiety, the wilting that comes with the flourishing, right? That there will be no opportunity to really understand what the fullness of a spiritual engagement would be if we don't understand what's happening in our bodies first, in our emotional landscapes, in the way that we understand our narratives, our ideas, our images, our mind images, if we don't see how it all's connected to the bodies of our landscapes, right? In the bodies of our earth, the bodies of all of these different lineages that I've been mentioning. So this disruption, this opportunity for transformation comes from really composting all these old narratives that need to be already put to dissolve, so that we can use all that raw material to transform into a new form of life, right? But in this case, the possibilities of contemplative practice is so rich because it is through contemplation that we take a step to observe what is that we tend to believe, what of those roots are actually coming from ideas that are imposed upon all of us, from stories that are old, and I return to Fletcher's acknowledgement, of the privilege of these systems of belief that were oppressive and that were exclusive, but how important it is to acknowledge and engage in conversation precisely with those systems, so that the new systems that we create are coming from these different voices that have had different experiences, that are coming from historically marginalized communities that have not had the platforms to express how we become resilient to these ways, and then transform our more narrow views to start including others. And I think there's incredible opportunities right now with the climate emergency, with what's happening with the rights of nature, right? And how we can transform all these old policies that are based on Roman law that only focus the personhood on human male white people, and to start really understanding that the very foundations of our identity as collective are already needing to transform, to include personhood to all these landscapes, living beings, ecosystems, environments that are created by responsive beings that are impacted by our presence and that clearly impact us, and then how we can then work together to create possibilities for flourishing for all, right? A collective, global, planetary flourishing that's coming from a very ethical system. This is the part of what my work on the ethics of belonging, like how do we create a system of values, ethical values that are based on belonging to a whole planet, to a whole global, alive, responsive being. So that is for now.
Thank you so much. So rich. And I'm just going to make a couple comments, and I suggest we might go around one more time because Fletcher, I suspect you have something to say after hearing those two. And but I wanted to just inject here sort of a humility that religion, ethics, morality, be it in these so-called world religions or indigenous traditions, all of them are fallible. All of them are imperfect and human, either institutions or communities. And so we don't want to idealize what religions can do, but we want to elevate the contributions they can make. And I'm just, suggesting the justice contributions of the Abrahamic traditions, as Fletcher has said, and the interdependence and compassion of Buddhism are absolutely essential. And of course, profound kinship and cosmovisions from the indigenous peoples. So all of this, I think, can contribute to what you've been speaking about, Yuria, the flourishing of planetary communities and all of their diversity. I also just wanted to highlight, because I'm sure it will come up in the questions, that environmental justice, while for many here in this conversation is far from new. In fact, it's decades old in the work you've all been doing. But I do have to say that even in academia, regrettably, it's something the scientists couldn't understand it at first, to be honest, at Yale. So it's taken a long, long time. And the pressure that you all will be giving into academia will be critical. So I think we're going to see some rapid changes there. But I also wanted to say, here at Yale in this new Center for Environmental Justice, there's a conference that is being planned for the fall on environmental joy, because part of this burnout, is that we forget the practices, as this whole conference is dealing with, that are regenerative, restorative, and so on, with nature, with contemplation, et cetera. And I would say, like Rod said, my burnout was in the 60s when I worked on civil rights in the anti-Vietnam War, and Nixon came into office. I said, I'm going out, leaving the US until he's out of office. And I went to Japan, studied Buddhism and the traditions of East Asia, and it changed my life. So burnout is a very real thing, and we have to figure out ways to support each other. And finally, rights of nature. Thomas Berry was one of the people who said early on, we need a new earth jurisprudence. And he really helped to birth this field into an astonishing growth that's, Earth Law centers now, and in the UN, it's being taken seriously. So these are very positive dimensions, I think, of the change that we're seeing. Environmental justice, environmental joy, rights of nature, and so on. But let's just do another round as to what are the kinds of issues that are coming up for you, Fletcher, for Lama Rod, and for Yuria, in terms of the obstacles we have to the conjunction of contemplation and action, or other things that might be on your mind. What are our obstacles, and how can we overcome them? What are some suggestions? Fletcher.
First of all, thanks again to Rod and Yuria. I really appreciated and enjoyed the things and learned from the things that you both said. One of the things that our really courageous team of Green Faith people in East Africa is working on is trying to stop the East Africa crude oil pipeline, which is a sort of extractivist nonsense project that Total, along with support from several major North American and Japanese banks and the Chinese National Offshore Oil Corporation, are trying to create. And it would be a pipeline that, by the time it's finished, would displace 100,000 people and destroy drinking water supplies, the poison waters that traditional farmers rely on. So it's exactly the kind of project that shouldn't happen right now. And so we work with local people who don't want the pipeline to go through. So a couple of weeks ago, one of them came to one of our team members and said that he had had his life threatened by an agent of Total, the corporation in charge of the project, which constantly greenwashes in the press in France and globally to say how much they care about clean energy and how respectful they are in the project sites that they've got, which is just an utter falsehood. And so we went through the process of working with this man to get him relocated temporarily. And to our knowledge, he's still safe. But what he did was he spoke up once publicly in a public meeting saying he didn't want the project to go through. I want those stories out there. You know, I mean, I meditate, pray, sing regularly, and I'm deeply grateful that I do because it helps keep me balanced. It's not the only thing that keeps me balanced. I mean, but it's one of the things that keeps me balanced, and I'm grateful for it. But I'm not grateful when that's the only side of the story that happens. There are too many stories from all over the world of courageous frontline people resisting absolutely appallingly unethical, immoral, disgusting, violent behavior. And this is not new, so I don't want to be naive about this. But if we've got, to me, a spirituality and a spiritual practice that does not involve surfacing those kinds of stories and direct sort of in the voice of the people who are suffering, and doesn't put that out on the table as something that we've got to reckon with, is missing the mark. I think a big part of what is going to change the world, because look, we don't have anywhere close to enough money to outspend the, or political power to outspend the people who are destroying the planet, the corporations, the governments. But what we do have is the simple power of human and beyond human truth. So the stories need to get shared, not just, certainly the stories of frontline people who are suffering, the stories of ecosystems that are getting devastated and destroyed, to follow what Yuria said. I think that alongside the wonderful, positive visions of the new reality that we need to juxtapose those with the concrete reality of what's happening now, because it's only where there's that kind of dynamic tension that people grow stronger and develop the courage and the strength to stand up in public, those who can. I mean, and I know, a good deal of my frustration comes from seeing too many in the United States, to give one example, too many white religious institutions failing to, just sort of treating religion as a sort of chaplaincy program to help them feel better to make it through the day, and not as something that it's really about. But that problem with religion isn't limited to the United States. It's present everywhere. It's religion's perennial problem. So I think, put the stories up alongside the words of vision and of comfort and of joy.
Thank you. Very powerful, Fletcher. Thank you. Lama Rod.
Yes, thank you. I think one of the things that I notice in my work is the tendency for folks to oversimplify the work and the crisis and the reality. And I think that we want a simple solution to a really complex situation. Not only is it complex, but it's a trans-historical situation. It's not something that just happened in our lifetime. It's something that has been going on for many generations. And the solution or the response to it has to be really, really complex. And so when I say complex, it's really about us having to do the work of understanding that we have to change in order to see the world change, that there is an immense amount of labor that we have to engage in to divest from systems that have conditioned us to believe that we have a right to dominate anyone or anything. right? I often say that oversimplification can be an act of violence, right? And so I think when I see folks coming into any kind of movement work, including climate work or racial justice work or anything like that, I think that folks really get kind of very anxious to understand that we have to unroot the impact of these systems within our own bodies and minds in order to see the change that we want to see in the world. And I don't know if I see enough people willing to engage in that kind of rigorous labor, right now. Because yes, it's more than just contemplative work, it's more than just spiritual work, it's also the work of how we have to disrupt the ways in which we are conditioned to relate to our bodies, to other people, to the phenomenal world, to the natural world as well. So I think people sometimes, a lot of folks can get really disheartened. They think that like all they have to do is show up to the protest, or all they have to do is write a letter to a legislator, or all they have to do is become a vegan, and buy an electric car or live off the land. It's actually quite more than that, right? It's really the work of changing how we understand who we are and that we belong to the phenomenal world and we belong to communities, that how I show up in the world has a direct impact in systems and communities and relationships all around me. And this kind of work, this kind of change work is slow and it's multi-generational, right? And I don't know if I will see the impact of my work in this life, right? But again, when I kind of lean back into a Buddhist worldview, I understand the arc and the span of liberation work. It's not just about this life. It's about multiple lives of returning over and over and over again to the work that matters. And the work that matters is really about helping people get free from the causes and conditions of suffering and helping the phenomenal world to be free from the ways in which we make assumptions about it that keeps it from being spacious and open and freeing and liberating as well. Right. So I commit to everything, right, in the work.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yuria, what's bubbling up in you?
I love how the different voices, perspectives, traditions, lineages, ontologies, epistemologies are all making sense, like each being a thread for this new fabric, what we are creating. And also conversing and building up on what has been said already. The resistance to self-examination, I think it's part of what keeps the limitations to seeing the institutionalized religions, and then that tendency to aim for the one truth, or the oversimplification, what we're saying, the universalizing experience, when even to the point in spiritual traditions of speaking of this oneness that in a way is also not acknowledging the differences of conditions that are really suffered around the world, and pretending that this cognitive imperialism in which only the privileged communities are the ones that know what truth means, or what spirit means, or what actions need to be taken in order to save the world, right? And these we see, unfortunately, in the aspects of conservation. Even myself, seeing, having worked at the UN for 15 years and seeing how decisions are made not really by large representations or by the local voices that need to be heard, but rather by the continuation of only a small group of privileged voices that are continuing the benefits and the the only way of seeing continuing the organization of the world, right? So I think there are also these silos between the global north, making decisions for the global south without really giving local communities the participation in the decision making process, or even understanding what they have known for millennia for living in their own lands, right? And as I said, we see this white saviorism, right? As if the global north understands what the conditions are in the world, or using that possibilities of change to only benefit their own benefits. And we see that in conservation, right? We see how the carbon offsetting is only benefiting the banks, right, in the global north, but not really the traditions that are that suffering the most. And that the idea of this 30 by 30 agenda, right, of the by 2030, 30% of the lands of the world would be protected, without understanding that that's also going to be taking the lands from indigenous communities to then use that as protected lands, without realizing that that is affecting the livelihood of people in the field, right? And then that lacking voice of representations that continues this extractive industry's economic interests, right? And silencing precisely the lands and rights defenders of these groups. Even myself, I have been working on defending the rights of indigenous peoples to our own spirit medicines, and I have been as well threatened and aim to silence my voice in order to benefit these new psychedelic misunderstanding within the Western research and praxis. So we see this in all levels of work in the world. So that I think the most important part is to really bring the voices that have not had platforms, and to give the decisions to those that have direct access and the stakeholders of the problematics that we are seeing right now.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for these truly insightful reflections. And we're getting some questions, of course, in the chat. And I thought maybe we could pick up just a one-on-one, one is on trauma, one's on inner resilience, one's on white supremacy. And I'm sort of thinking of the white supremacy might go over to Fletcher and Lama Rod, the trauma one to both Yuria and Rod. And we'll do sort of a combination, maybe just of two responding to them. So maybe we take up this question of what are some of the obstacles, right? One is white supremacy in this country and in other parts of the world. So Fletcher and Lama Rod, whoever wants to begin, this is a huge question and just overwhelming in every institution in our country, clearly, churches as well as academia and corporations, et cetera. So Lama Rod, why don't you start, and Fletcher, you can pick it up perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, this is such a key part of climate change work, is actually dismantling white supremacy. For, just speaking from the perspective of being a member of, Black and Brown and Indigenous communities, really trying to focus on climate change work, we get so diverted by the impact of white supremacy and the history of white supremacy in our communities and in our ancestry. So the burden around doing the work of climate change also has to include undoing white supremacy for a lot of white folks who aren't interested in doing that work for themselves, right? And so when I'm talking about, the work at hand, I'm really telling people that if you're not, particularly for white organizers and practitioners, right? If you're not actively dismantling white supremacy, you're not really doing climate change work, right? But it's more than just white supremacy. It's patriarchy, it's capitalism, it's the prison industrial complex, right? It's misogyny, it's all these isms, right, that actually combine to really enhance and deepen the impact of climate change, right? So this is a heavy burden. Like, this is a tall order for us, right? And if we're not addressing white supremacy, we're not really doing climate change liberation work.
And this is why one of the powerful moments of our time is social justice and environmental justice coming together. To say the obvious, but I want to underscore it because for more than 20 years in academia, these has been considered totally separate. So Fletcher, please, thank you so much, Lama Rod, and Fletcher, please jump in.
Yeah, no, thank you, Rod. I agree fully. I mean, I think, you know, speaking as a white man, you know, who's come from a very privileged place, I think it's absolutely essential. It's not optional as, you know, part of this stuff. And, you know, you see the predictable backlash of, you know, discomfort and white people sort of all of a sudden, you know, I mean, it's a deep identity challenge, you know, and what I try to remember and what I'm humbled by remembering is, man, if this is feeling uncomfortable for me, imagine what the hell it must feel like for people who are not white or not male, you know, I mean, really. So I think that, you know, for those of us who are white, Caucasian, it's just essential. We got to step up and be grateful that there are so many people of color who are still willing to engage in this with us. You know, talk about you know, undeserved grace, right? I mean, it's not like most of us white folks have done much of anything to deserve that kind of. So I think there's that. I also think that it's really important to look at this as an issue of power. I mean, for example, I look at what the Modi government is doing in India, and I think that's as reprehensible a use of culture and religion and government power and religious nationalism as we see in a lot of places. So you know, it's like that. I think it was some 19th century British guy who said that the one Christian doctrine that's been empirically verified is original sin. And I don't think that there's any, I don't think there's any culture that's perfect or that is devoid of, you know, the possibility that it's going to do really terrible wrong if it gets its hands on enough power. The problem we've got is that white folks have had their hands on all the power for way too long. And so we've got to dismantle that. So I think we got to go at it. I also do, and I think, you know, for white people, I think this raises the thing of just got to be able to make people uncomfortable. You know, the amount of wealth controlled in the United States and Western Europe by white people, white-run corporations, white-founded corporations is just unthinkable. So, you know, we've got to stir the pot on that. And we've got to elevate the stories and the voices of folks who can shine the light on what this feels like from their perspective, because when those stories get out, they have power.
Yeah, and I just want to underscore, thank you, Fletcher. You know, as a student of Asia, I'm so glad you've mentioned Modi, because Modi caused one of the largest disruptions against Muslims in modern history in Gujarat when he was head of that province. And the effect of his administration on minorities, especially Muslims, has been horrendous up through Kashmir, but all through India. And it is, in other words, there's supremacy, white supremacy, Hindu supremacy, religious supremacy, nationalist supremacy, and as Lama Rod said, we've got to bring them all together. And I'm going to turn it over to Yuria, because the gender issues, the patriarchal issues that, I'm sorry, be you white, be you different ethnic things. I came to Yale and there were no tenured women in the School of the Environment, and the patriarchy in academia is nauseating as it is everywhere. So we have to keep working on these issues. And thank you so much, both of you, for what the intersectionality clearly is hugely important. Yuria, what do you want to add to this conversation?
Yes, the issue of supremacy. Absolutely. We need to go back to the realization that it is all about the supremacy of power. It's not only about race, it's not only the white supremacy issue, it's also about gender, it's about class, it's ethnicity, it's about ableism as well, who has an able body and who's not, and then of course, as it was just being touched, the epistemological supremacy, right? Who has the authority to decide what is considered truth, or how we should understand the nature of the world or the cosmos, right? So this idea of supremacy in the end is a fear of the other, right? It's not really engaging in conversation with the other. But if we don't realize that we ourselves are a multiplicity, we are coming from all these great diverse lineages, as I mentioned in the very beginning of my talk, or my contribution to the talk, is that if we are afraid of the other, then we are also afraid of ourselves. And then start coming up with not being able to be in our own bodies, or recursing to addiction or to any kind of numbing of our experience in the world. And then, of course, avoiding any kind of dialogue that then will mirror our reality. Right, that will bring us back to this shadows facing process that I was mentioning earlier. And so if we don't have that conversation within those stories that we carry and that we are carrying out as well, then we won't have the possibility to then bridge, right? I think that being able to engage in a vulnerable place for conversation, it's extremely important, but very rare, because most times whenever dialogue happens, it's coming from a place of shaming or a place of guilt that does not allow for an honest conversation to happen and to really engage in a transformative process together. Right. So in order to realize that we can then bridge and come into not really even a sort of compromise, but realizing that our own well-being comes from the well-being of others. This belonging of the in the ecological system. Understand that this multiplicity, this flourishing and the wilting, the othering and the belonging, the me and the others are all fallacies, because the duality is a trap that does not allow us to expand what we are and then engage also in the realization that all others are also part of ourselves, and then we are part of all others' experiences. So perhaps that and that I think right now it's also coming up, the humility and the curiosity. How do we come from a place of trust, especially coming from an oppressive point of view? How do we start trusting in those systems that have not even acknowledged yet a process of reparation, that starts very quickly talking about reciprocity, when there is actually not yet that process of understanding what is the story that we keep perpetuating. And that comes for all of us, because in many ways, all of us are privileged in some sort of way, either within education or within gender or we are all privileged in some sort of way, and we are also, of course, oppressed in other ways. So how do we let go of that reification of our identity to allow ourselves to be transformed from our engagement with all others.
Thank you. Thank you so much. There's a question coming up that's coming up into almost every webinar and meeting together in this ever-growing movement of environmental justice and so on. And that question is, what gives you hope? What are the things that we can put forward together to encourage one another, encourage the next generation and those who are on the front lines suffering incredible both imprisonment and deaths, especially in the developing world and Latin America and the Amazon rainforest, et cetera. So what gives hope? Anyone who wants to start? Lama Rod, you're kind of nodding your head, so maybe you want to lead off.
Yeah, absolutely. I talk about this every day. And I practice this, I try to practice this every day. I will say for me, as I mentioned earlier, in our time together, my ancestors give me a lot of hope. My ancestors survived chattel slavery, right? And made it possible for me to be in the world a lot freer than they experienced freedom. And so I remember that. I come from people who struggle, who are resilient, who survive, who have always centered joy in our work and in our lives, and because we centered joy, we've offered joy to so many other movements, in this country and around the world. I remember what I'm grateful for every day. I remember that there's still beauty in the world. I remember that there's still people really ready and in the process of waking up to their work, and people are figuring out what their work is, and they're going to the front lines, and that's happening more and more every day, and that's hopeful for me, and from a Buddhist perspective, I understand too that this world is an experience. Like, this is something that I'm moving through, that I'm passing through, right? And so I don't feel so trapped by this reality. And at the same time, I am deeply connected to the experiences of all beings moving through this world at the same time. And that balances the intensity of work for me. I work really hard, and at the same time, I understand the nature of this work and the nature of this world at the same time. And as my ancestors used to say, this world is not our home, right? But I am passing through, and I am obligated. I have an ethical obligation to be of help and to be of benefit to, all beings and the phenomenal world as well. So all of that guides me and actually instills a really deep sense of gratitude and joy at the same time as I struggle, to do what I need to do to experience liberation.
Thank you. What a beautiful, beautiful answer. Fletcher, what's your response there?
Yeah, so I mean, so when I start to answer this question, I say my first answer is that actually I don't experience a lot of hope around this. It's not a theme or a topic that I mean, and so then I ask, okay, so what do I understand by hope? So one sort of way is, around the climate change stuff. I remember 15, 20 years ago being in a meeting with a number of other movement leaders, and a wise and respected teacher saying, look, let's be real here. Raise your hand if you think that in the next 10 to 15 years, there's going to be strong legislation in most countries around the world to address climate change, and we're really going to sort of bend the curve and things are going to be heading in a much better direction. And like 80% of the people in the room, myself included, said, yeah, we think it's going that way. And that's clearly not what's happened. So I don't see in the in the sort of trajectory of where the climate crisis is moving, I don't think that there's certainly not rational basis for hope. So that starts to crack the door open for some of the other ways of thinking about what does this mean. To me, what keeps me going is I like seeing that people from all over the world, from every imaginable kind of background, look at this same reality and don't crawl back under the sheets, but get up and go to work. I think that's really cool. That to me, I like seeing that when people find ways of saying, I see this and I'm not standing down. I'm going to bring my piece. So to me, I like that. I don't necessarily think of that as hope, but that may be because I have an insufficient understanding of hope. So I like that. I like working with I like seeing younger people. I like seeing them just utterly furious that, you know, my generation and generations older have refused to see what's so obvious. I think it's great that they get out in the streets and take off from school on Fridays. And, you know, so to me, I like that. Again, I don't think of that as hope, but I like it. It's what keeps me going. I mean, there's other stuff that keeps, I mean, I want to be real about this too. Like climate change isn't the only thing I think about. I'm a sports fan. I like that. It doesn't give me hope. My teams stink most of the time, but I don't, to me, the hope question runs the risk. And I love, this is why I love the way Rod answered, because it was for real. But it runs the risk of like inviting, oh, I believe in this and this in this kind of precious way that's not real. I mean, to me, I like being with real people who are dealing with the real stuff and who aren't always hopeful, but who are alive and who keep on showing up. So to me, that's what works best.
Love it. Love it. That's terrific, both of you. Thank you. And Yuria, what about you?
I'm coming also from the suspicion way of seeing hope. Like I see hope as a trap, actually, you know, just as many people look bleak as a way of avoiding the realities of the world, you know, and the spiritual bypassing that I mentioned earlier. Because this idea of hope perhaps also comes from this empowerment of thinking that there's going to be an entity or something else that's going to happen and is going to solve the problem, you know, suddenly. And it's not taking responsibility of what our part is in changing this problem, right? So rather, I'd like to see it more as a commitment. So not hope, but rather commitment, because commitment pushes the responsibility, you know, pushes awareness of what can I do, you know, and understands that we have a possibility of transforming what we see. And then that commitment also comes first and foremost to Mother Earth, to whom we owe our life, knowing the wholeness of nourishment and the wholeness of devourment as well, you know, as we see the rage that's coming also from her own heart. You know, but how that the same wisdom of Mother Earth, you know, coming from the observation of nature, you know, as resilience, as in one moment also, you know, the impermanence of 1 second, everything can be completely erased, eradicated, but only that from those ashes comes the new life or the new reemergence of possibilities, you know, the reemergence of a new way of life. And then understanding that that commitment is timeless. It comes from learning from the past, aiming for an intentional future that is right here, right now. All those times are right here. And knowing that my home is the other. Our home is all others. This is part of, that's my commitment and the invitation also.
Thank you.
Belong to all others.
All right. Thank you so much. Beautiful, beautiful, each one of you. And since the question was also directed to me, I'll just pop in here to affirm, of course, some things you've already said, but my students give me great hope. The youth movement that Fletcher mentioned, of course, gives us enormous hope. I've been waiting for that my whole life. And Greta and so many other young leaders are just so inspiring. And as I say, students who come here to study at the environment, they know the facts. They know the dire situation that we're up against, but they're still willing to go into nonprofit work and jobs that won't make them a lot of money, but make a difference in the world. And I love that Tequila's put into the chat, I hope for hope, but I trust courage, which is a beautiful saying. I hope for hope, but I trust courage. And Natalie is saying maybe there's a hope in the action, this critical mass that's coming forward that I think Yuria just touched on as well. And I want to be very specific that, you know, the cosmovisions that are so present in indigenous traditions, but also in the Asian traditions, that we are connected not just to the human order society, we're connected to Earth, as you've all said eloquently, but we're connected to the cosmos. And this is being revived in unbelievable ways. This is part of what Thomas Berry was trying to do in Journey of the Universe, to say we're part of a 13.8 billion year system. That changes the way we think. We've showed this film in China, and 77,000 people have watched it because they have a sense of cosmology and Earth and human as connecting. And that also gives us a sense of hope, because it's a renewal of the energy that comes throughout these systems in Qi, in matter energy systems, which we're understanding bits of more and more. We're trying to practice Tai Chi, Qigong, the healing arts of medicine from China, medicine from India, medicine from indigenous peoples. And I also think there's great hope in what's coming from science and studies of animal behavior, of bird behavior, of reptilian behavior, of all of the living creatures on this planet that have intelligences that are more than ours, different from ours, migration patterns, communication of trees. We had 9,000 people here on a webinar talking about trees and communication. This is lighting people up with new and fresh energy for the protection, for the action that needs to be done. And that's coming from both science and environmentalism and certainly indigenous sensibilities. I think the Pope's encyclical Laudato Si, praise be, right? Let's praise the beauty and complexity here. Bill McKibben says it's the most important document of the 21st century because it brings this eco-justice into focus. Cry of the earth, cry of the poor. It's a remarkable document. We could say a lot more. But finally, I think some of the interreligious movements, which were not possible even in my youth, where these were so siloed, you didn't even walk into a Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, you didn't even walk into the churches. It was so siloed. But now we have interreligious movements like the Interreligious Rainforest Initiative that the Norwegian government is supporting, the United Nations Environment Program, various groups of religious organizations. But what is it doing? It's saying we cannot save rainforests without the voices of indigenous peoples who've been there for millennia. And so it's supporting this traditional environmental knowledge. It's saying Christian groups across the Amazon and so on, or in the Congo, Muslim groups in Indonesia have got to support and work with these voices, wisdom, traditions. That is a transformative moment. And the Norwegians, who had spent $4 billion in 12 years trying to conserve rainforests, said, we're not doing it right because we're not including the peoples of this area. So that is a new and very, I think, remarkable movement. And finally, in the Middle East, there's Eco-Peace Middle East, where the Abrahamic traditions trying to work against great odds on conservation of the Jordan River and peace efforts there. So these are things against a lot of odds. I've got plenty of the scientific facts coming at me day in and day out at Yale and elsewhere, as we all do, which are very, very debilitating. But if we can keep that energy open and trust the courage, as Tequila says, I think we have a lot of possibility. Now, there's a question also that maybe we can end on that would carry this theme forward, and that is, you know, and maybe we can be somewhat brief. We've got about 6 minutes, but how can we deal with trauma which is clearly an upheaval as well, maybe the different world wars, but this is a moment of trauma, isn't it? It's a rite of passage for the human community, of exceeding trauma. Lama Rod, you've referred to it, Indigenous peoples have experienced it, et cetera. So are there a few things that we can offer here in terms of this conference, the participants, to respond to trauma? Big question, no simple answers, but I'm going to start with you, Lama Rod, because you've thought about it a lot and written about it a lot, and then go to Yuria and maybe end up with Fletcher.
Yeah, this is a huge question. I would say that we have to start understanding really the importance of healing justice, which essentially is that we have to understand that healing is actually essential to justice work, right? And to begin to name the impacts of trauma, to begin to bring into consciousness what has been so invisible for many people, right? And to begin to reconstruct our systems and the ways that we interact in a way that is trauma informed, to understand that perhaps so much of our culture is actually just a trauma response, as well, and to start doing that kind of, again, another kind of rigorous labor to understand, that trauma isn't something that we're trying to self-identify with to create culture and belonging. It's something that we're trying to heal and transcend from and release in order to enter into a right relationship with our bodies, with our minds, with the phenomenal world, and with our communities.
Thank you. Thank you. I just realized, I don't know, Fletcher, you might want to go next and we'll let Yuria have the last word. Would that be all right?
Sure. Building on everything that Rod said and that Rod and Yuria have said in the past 90 minutes, I would say simply assume trauma's presence everywhere. Use it as a starting point, not as something that it takes years to get to, but start with the assumption that we live in a world where at a systemic, interpersonal, and every other level, trauma is a defining reality. Start there, because it hastens the deconstruction that needs to happen, and it reckons with reality on the appropriate level from the starting point.
That's very, very helpful. Thank you, both of you. Yuria, what's your thinking on this?
I was not so long ago asked, how do we prepare for chaos? And I said, well, that's precisely the key. You can't prepare for chaos. Chaos is precisely that moment of dismemberment, of letting go of control, of realizing that we don't have all the truths, but rather that we need to embody the process of composting, compost our narratives, compost our collective stories that keep us stagnant, separated, isolated, and to remember, to put our members together is to reconnect. Seeing trauma as an opportunity for reconnection is seeing trauma as an opportunity for community. Bridging comes from suffering, from acknowledging that we are in this together. So what our bodies are sensing is what our Mother Earth is sensing, that is shared with all others. So to go through, we need to embrace and then work through that as a community of engaged living beings.
Beautiful, beautiful. And there's a comment by Natalie that justice work, climate justice work heals, and that healing dimension that I think you're all pointing towards as well is maybe a note that we can end on, with immense gratitude for each of you, your work, your lifeblood, your energies, your own resilience, the leadership roles you have, and may they continue to flourish. Tequila, again, thank you. Mirtha, thank you so much. And the last word over to Tequila with gratitude, a bow of gratitude.
Thank you so much, all of you. Oh my gosh, this has been such an incredible conversation. I didn't want it to end, even though this is the last panel of this entire 3 days. For those of you who've been with us through the whole 3 days, I commend you. Talk about commitment, dedication, courage, hope. You know, listening to the four of you, I mean, what really came up for me was just the balance between wisdom and compassion, and the importance of faith leaders, right? The importance of moral justice, you know. One of the things I talk about all the time when I talk about why LOCA works with religious leaders is just how important religious leaders have been throughout history in terms of changing the tide, right? When you think about the upper tide and you think about the movement towards human rights as a universal value, you think about, you know, Gandhi, of course, is often mentioned, Martin Luther King being a reverend, people often forget that, right? How important the Black church was for the civil rights movement. And now in this time of environmental and climate crisis, how much it matters that faith leaders are stepping forward from this framework of moral justice. We know that when it comes to divestment of fossil fuels, for example, which is in the trillions of dollars, faith communities are actually 1/3 of all of the divestment in the world from fossil fuels. It's really easy to forget what moral justice brings us. The other part that came up and really resonated with me was justified anger. I did a Tonglen meditation on anger yesterday, and I quoted Lama Rod. You know, in his book, there is this point where he's talking about anger, what it's like to be a Black man, how dangerous anger is. And then there's the sentence he has, which is, anger is the bodyguard of my heartbrokenness. And to me, this time that we are in, having our hearts broken and still having to keep our hearts open is the only way to live in this time of uncertainty. And I feel like all four of you just exemplify that, you know, what it's like to do those two things simultaneously and give love continuously, no matter what. So I thank you so much. We have had, I'm still amazed we have so many participants because it's been so packed, the schedule. So for everyone that's left, thank you so much for being with us. We have over 1,500 people who've registered. Everyone will get links to all of the videos. We have saved all the chat. All the resources will also be sent out. And I think you've all heard enough from me. So I'll say a final thank you.